Mike Klonsky. I'm a retired education professor. I also, in 1991, along with people like Bill Ayers and some others, started the Small Schools Workshop over at the University of Illinois in Chicago, where we were teaching. It was originally, it originally came about as a result of some of the research that we were doing that had to do with the size of schools and things like school violence, the use of tobacco and and alcohol and drugs on the part of students, teenage pregnancy and test scores and things like that, how the size of school influenced those things. And we began to see a lot of the negative outcomes that we were looking at had to do with big schools, big anonymous schools. And we put together a workshop really where lots of teachers who were looking for alternatives to the traditional school system began coming over to UIC and taking part in discussions and workshops about how to create new kinds of schools. And the small became the motto, but really they weren't about smallness. They were about social change, about how to create schools that were democratic schools that prepared students to become good citizens in a democratic society. But it wasn't just about preparation, it was about how students could live a democratic education themselves in the moment. How they could not just be prepared for a job, but do serious work as young people, and in the company of adults, of caring, nurturing adults. And so out of that workshop, the small schools movement developed here in Chicago. And it was also, the same thing was happening other places too. New York, Philadelphia, where people just like us, people who influenced us and people who we communicated with back and forth, began exploring new ideas about schooling and redesign of schooling and doing things like project-based learning and active education, where young people really took control of their own learning. And you know, part of our influence was actually the de-schooling movement, you know, where there was no structured education, but where people figured it out along the way, made the road by walking it. In fact, that became the title of a very influential book for me by Paulo Freire and Miles Horton, called We Make the Road by Walking It. And that's kind of how the small schools movement developed. But we had certain fundamental ideas about democratic education and situating this movement in the context of democratic social change, social justice, and things like that. And it wasn't just about small. To us, small was the launch pad, not the rocket ship. So having small schools enabled teachers to do things like meet together as a community. It enabled them to have a lot of time to experiment. It enabled teachers and students to stay together long enough to really get to know each other. And it was built on an idea that you can't really teach young people unless you know them well and they know you. And there's a trust factor. And the way we looked at assessment and evaluation was quite the opposite of the way things are being done today. They had to do not so much with testing, with standardized testing, which we rejected as a authentic way to know what kids learn and can do, but really by performance kind of assessments, where we would look at the work that students did and talk to them about it, and even do bring in outside people to assess them like you do in a doctoral dissertation. But this we were doing with elementary school kids and middle school and high school students. So we were really trying to turn the whole education system upside down and figure out, the fundamental question we were trying to figure out was, how do you do this kind of authentic, meaningful education in a society that is toxic to all those ideas, that is undemocratic, and even now being borderline fascist because of who the people we have in the White House. So how, as a democratic and progressive educator, how do you do your work given the external pressures that are coming down on schools in society? And the big change that was made since that time is we've learned how to do it inside the school system itself. We've learned how to penetrate the school system itself with radical ideas about teaching and learning, and how to resist the pressures to standardize, to privatize, to take the public out of public education. And so that's really what we came to be about. And even though I'm retired now, I'm still very much involved in that kind of work.